Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Optimizing Well-Being for Business Success. I'm Kathleen Cooke, Chief Client Officer at Human Synergistics. While most of our webinars focus on culture, team development, and leadership impact, today we're excited to welcome our partners at Axialent to discuss one of the most relevant topics in business today, that is improving well-being for business success. Axialent's program centers around learning how to learn what works for your own well-being. To explain more, it's my pleasure to introduce our colleagues from Axialent, Oseas Ramirez Assad, Axialent board member, and Connie Busto, Axialent partner. Oseas will kick things off with a brief presentation, and then I'll host a panel discussion with Connie. We intend to have some time for Q&A at the end, so please submit your questions through the GoToWebinar question pane throughout the course of the webinar. Okay, I will now hand things over to Oseas to get us started. Oseas, please take it away.
Thank you, Kath, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. Unfortunately, we cannot see each other. There's too many of us, but it's fantastic to have the opportunity to connect with you. And as Kath mentioned, today we will present to you just very briefly an overview of Optimal Me, and then we'll pass it on to have a conversation, and then eventually we'll open up for Q&A with all of you. So without further ado, let's get started. So what is Optimal Me? Give me just a second just to get the screen ready. So Optimal Me, as you'll see just from the tagline, it's a program that centers around the idea of experimentation to have a better life. And with that in mind, the aspects of Optimal Me that are more critical that I'd like to highlight right up front is that this program that highlights experimentation obviously is infused with a science-based mindset that you can utilize to learn what works for you at this point in your life to increase your personal and professional well-being. And by the way, that answer for you might not be the same that it is for someone else. So given that this is something that we need to learn, and by the way, it'll not be the same answer for you now as it'll be in 10 years from now, a very good skill to acquire is learning how to learn what works for you. So that's what Optimal Me centers around. So from that perspective, when we talk about well-being programs, you'll see that a lot of times there is a perspective that is a little bit prescriptive, like well-being programs in general, or the industry will come and say, here's what you need to do to be well, and they will come up with this method that maybe has a cute acronym that will tell you what you need to do, and it's easy to remember. And here we're not advocating for that. Instead, we're saying, how do we help you develop the skills so that you can find out what works for yourself? So from that perspective, we move from the overarching monolithic method to the learning abilities space. And even more importantly than that, one of the things that we want to change is when it comes to well-being, a lot of the aspects that have to do with it come with the weight of should. I should lose weight. I should exercise more. I need to read more. There's always should component. And granted that it makes sense because these are good things for us. One of the things that we try to do is shift the focus from the should into the fun and the learning joy that kids know very well and that sometimes we as adults forget. So how do we put these things together? Well, to explain this and just now start outlining what is exactly that we do, I want to present to you two problems and then how we go about solving them. And in the middle of these two problems, I'm going to ask you to help us participate in a poll. You will need just your phone. Maybe you can snap a QR code and you can open up a window in your browser. It's coming up in a second. But let's start with the first problem. So the first problem is rather obvious at this point in time, and that is that there has been some decline of well-being recently. Now, obviously, what comes to mind is, yes, it's been the coronavirus. But I would say that even before the coronavirus, things were not that great on the well-being department. For example, at Axialent, we had tons of our customers coming to us saying, a great amount of my population is suffering from symptoms of burnout to some degree or capacity. We are facing lots of stress inside of our organization because our business is getting digitally disrupted and we don't know how to move on forward. And then you get all the fun we've had with different social political movements around the world. And that set up the stage for something that was already a little bit difficult. Then you put coronavirus on top of that, and it gets us where we are, which if we were burned out, Harvard Business Review article in February would say, yeah, we're past beyond burnout. So this problem is very well established. We don't really need to go deep in it, but I just want to establish it as a first problem. We are beyond burnout, or we have some problems in well-being, or it has declined. However that translates to you, then again, our experiences are different, but we know that it has been trending downward mostly speaking. We have lots of research for it, but let's just stay with that initial problem. The second problem is that we mostly know what to do, or we have, in most cases, a good intuitive sense of the things that we need to do to be better. I'm just going to be very broad at this point. And to illustrate that, I want to take a quote that I gathered from a question they asked Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. And they were asking him something about technology. And he says that the question that he gets more frequently is, what's going to happen in the next 10 years? What's going to change? What's going to be the new things coming up in the next 10 years? And he said, a far more interesting question is, what is not going to change in the next 10 years? And people rarely ever ask me that. He used this as an example for Amazon, and he nailed it, obviously, in many of the aspects that he said, these things are not going to change. People are going to want to get their things that they're buying quicker. They're going to want them cheaper now and in 10 years. That's not going to change. Why not focus my effort on those things that are going to remain versus trying to guess what's going to come up in 10 years? So that struck me as an interesting way of thinking that then we could extrapolate for our well-being. So just to explain how we do this, let's first then join this initial Menti. So you have the QR code. Again, you can snap it on your camera and open up, or you can just go to menti.com in your browser and enter the code. I'll give you a second to do this, and then I'm just going to ask you 3 questions to reflect on this point from a perspective of well-being. So as you're snapping this code, I'm going to show in my screen the actual poll to see what results we're getting. So if you have not snapped the code, you can still go to menti.com and just enter the code. And the question is, in one word, please try to keep it to one word, what hasn't changed or mostly doesn't change in terms of what we value in life? What is it that most people seem to value and pursue? There we go. We have the first responses. So these are things that we value today, we value 10 years ago, we'll most likely value 10 years from now. Right, we have initial responses, and then obviously this word cloud will give us a sense of how many times some things like this repeat. But as we start getting the first responses, we'll see that family, health, happiness, love, connection, these things are starting to pop up a little bit more than some others. Let's give a little more time for this to evolve. All right, so we can use this as a North Star. It's very intuitive, nothing surprising here. We know that we value family relationships, health, happiness, love, all these things, they matter to us. Great. So I would then present that this is something that we can use to guide ourselves. Now, let me ask you a slightly different question. Tell me one thing that you know is good for you, or one thing that you know is good for you to stop doing, but even then, you don't do it. So for example, yeah, I know that I need to stop drinking, but I still drink. Or maybe it is, yeah, I know that I need to start exercising because it's good for me, but I don't do it, or I haven't been able to do it consistently. So what are some of those examples of things that you know that are good for you, and for whatever reason, you're not doing them consistently? So we have first responses here: exercise, sleep, meditation, losing weight, eating healthy, stopping the drinking, stopping the wine. I'm assuming there's a stopping there because we're using one word. If you need more, well, might be easier to get there. Less sugar, yoga, stopping snacking, setting boundaries, eating better, etc., etc., etc. So we start getting a sense of, yes, these are things that I know that are good for me, but I'm not doing them, or I'm not doing them consistently. This takes me to the last question, as we see additional ones like eating less sugar, having a fitness lifestyle, taking my personal time, reconciliation, less time on screens, etc. Let's think about the exercise, the eating healthy, the meditation, these things that you know are good for you, yet you don't do them. My final question would be, why? Why is it that you don't do those things that you know are good for you? I have a few options here. The options could be, well, I don't meditate or I don't exercise because maybe I do not sufficiently understand it, or I don't have time, or I don't have discipline or willpower to do it, or I don't have the resources to do that, or maybe it's something else. So that will go under other. So let's see how this takes shape. All right, as we're nearing the 20th entry, we see that the lack of discipline and willpower right now seems to be the most popular response around why we don't do certain things that we know are good for ourselves. Right. So I'm going to leave this open because at this point, I think this is probably a good sample of the responses that we're getting. So we'll get back to this idea of the lack of discipline later on. So following this train of thought, then what I want to present to you is that change is difficult for a variety of different things, and it's not a surprise to anybody in this call that there is a gap between the things that we know are good for us and the things that we actually do. And when we ask people in general, why do we have this gap of things that you understand and you don't do them? The answer looks like this: lack of discipline or willpower. By the way, you as an audience of this webinar are not an exception. We've run this questionnaire with people, executives in North America, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the response always looks like this. The pink column that has to do with discipline and willpower always wins. So we seem to have a narrative that tells us, yes, we know things that will allow us to be better, but we don't do them out of a lack of discipline or willpower. And that puts us in a situation that's a little bit difficult to solve. And this is where I would like for us to propose to move forward, which is if we have our first problem is well-being is declining, and our second problem is, well, we know what to do, but we don't do it. I would then say the third problem that connects these two is that we don't do it partly because we think we lack willpower. And even though that could be an important component, it's not the most important one. And here comes our first perspective on how can we break out of this conundrum. So for optimal me, when we're looking at well-being, we try to combine three aspects: behavioral science, innovation methodologies, and the well-being itself. So I'm going to break out these three parts and give you examples with a narrative of a personal example that is, by the way, now representative of many of the examples that we have in the program. So years ago, a decade ago, I have been pursuing my athletic endeavors, which has been part of my life, and eating healthy with the help of doctors and nutritionists. But for some reason, every time at around lunch, I would have a lot of abdominal, intestinal discomfort, and it was very annoying, quite honestly. And I went with different doctors and nutritionists that would tell me, do this, don't do that, take this medicine. And the best that I could get was some relief. And this went on for years. Then a good friend of mine who's a doctor came and said, hey, would you like to pretty much hack your metabolism by playing with macronutrient ratios? And I was like, that sounds interesting. I don't fully understand the implications, but why not? I don't think my situation is going to get any worse. So I asked myself the question, what would happen if I start testing with this thing he's bringing forward? And that put me into an interesting journey. So we started then with a perspective that comes from well-being science and practices. Now, we know that well-being science and practices, we could have many areas to explore. It could be something that is new in the space of neuroscience or how our mind and emotions work, maybe something that has to do with productivity, something in the triad of nutrition, sleep, and workout, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In my case, it was something that had to do with my nutrition. So I took that as my experimentation area and said, okay, I'm going to try this approach. Now, just committing to trying something, obviously, is not enough because of what we've discussed. So I needed a little bit more help. And that's where the behavioral science comes in. Now, there's tons of literature right now in behavioral science, where there is these books that promise to you the ultimate method on how to approach habit formation, or maybe it's a slightly different approach, the growth mindset, and we see a lot of this in corporations and how much it matters. It could be something that has to do with, I don't know, how to get yourself in a state of flow and sustain it. There's many aspects, and we bake this into optimal me. In my case, I started taking a few cues from habit formation to make it easier to make the changes in my nutrition that would allow me to make the shift. So this included, for example, increasing the availability of the high-fat type of foods that I needed and decreasing the availability of the carbohydrate sources that the hypothesis at the time stated was harming me. So we could go a lot deeper into this, but at the end of the day, the whole point is we utilize some pages from behavioral science to make it easier to run this experiment. Then finally, we designed the experiment with the utilization of innovation methodologies. Now, if you come from a corporate space, you may be familiar with some of the most famous versions of innovation methodologies, which include design thinking, agile, lean startup, and many others. So I've worked for years advising senior leaders from Fortune 500 organizations in this type of methodologies for the development of new products and services. The question that I had in my mind was, how can I get the value that I see from this and apply this to myself? So in this case, for design thinking, was starting with the definition of the problem, ideating, prototyping some solution, testing. In Agile, we took the idea of sprints. So I was doing 2-week sprints in testing my nutrition. And with Lean Startup, essentially was a cycle of build, measure, learn, and refining. So this eventually became core to the methodology of Optimal Me, and more importantly, to the mindset behind Optimal Me when we say, I am an innovation project. I'm going to treat myself as such. So through the combination of the behavioral science, some aspects from well-being science in general, and innovation methodologies, in my particular case, I was able to figure out that if I enter the state of ketosis, nutritional ketosis, all the symptoms that I've had for years disappear in a space of 48 hours, and I can prove that with the different devices that I got, whether it is ketone measurement, self-reported symptoms, and then blood work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a very interesting discovery for me, because then it led me down the path, not of becoming a ketosis zealot, but instead of getting very curious around, what was it about carbohydrates that starts harming me? Now I can have much more meaningful conversations with my doctor when I say, let's talk about FODMAP carbohydrates and how we isolate the ones that are harming me the most, and then trying to find out how that works. The point that I'm trying to highlight here is, by putting these 3 things together, I was able to start finding the answer that I needed, that I was not able to find in the cookie cutter versions of approaches that I had tried in the past, including the medical attention that was provided to me. There's many, many other examples, but at the end of the day, what came from this combination of behavioral science, innovation methodologies, and cutting-edge well-being sciences is what we call the Optimal Me habit innovation method, in which we essentially replicate this cycle of doing startup, or if you want the cycle of something similar to the scientific method, in which we start really connecting with the self-empathy and compassion, and going from there to the motive that prompts us into action. We gather some information, we actually design experiments, we run them, and when these experiments work for us, then we try to automate those aspects so that we can turn them into habits. I know there's a lot to unpack here, but this is the method that we follow with our participants, and the end results look like this. We have executives in different parts of the world doing interesting things like monitoring their emotions and tracking how that is being affected by their practice of meditation. They start journaling and they see how that helps with some aspect of the relationship. They start helping their teams with so-and-so regarding their nutrition or their work, the workout aspect. And Connie will be giving us specific examples later on. But the gist of this is then this program leads to people taking on to themselves, running the experiments with which they learn what works for them. My invitation in this case would be, if you take an experimentation mindset and have fun with it and just have a little bit of rigor and really search, you may be able to find what are the things that you need to change so that you can now become successful at doing these things that are good for you, whether it's exercising, getting more sleep, eating healthy, meditating, having less wine, stopping snacking, you name it, these things that you said, these things are good for me, and I'm not doing them. Well, what I'm proposing to you is there might be a different way of approaching it. One, which, by the way, has a lot less than we would like to think when it comes to the aspect of willpower. And then this connects with the things that we value the most. So it's a simple line of sight. Here's what I value. Here's things that help me attain it, but I'm not able to do them or sustain them. Well, let's learn how is it that I can actually do the exercise, the meditation, or the nutrition in service of what I want to achieve. So that's the gist of the program. Now, if you want to know how we do it, we can go a little bit more in depth later on. But suffice it to say for now that the program in our current days and times is multimodal. So we have in person, well, that was 2019, but we will get back to that whenever it's appropriate, but now it's been replaced for a lot of things that we do online. We have the online asynchronous component. We have our own learning platform. We have obviously the live web conferencing aspects you're familiar with. We have micro coaching with different types of specialists that can help you with the different aspects of the experiment that works for you. So if you want to experiment with your nutrition, with your exercise, with your meditation, with your productivity, with some breathing technique, etc. We will guide you through this and give you the support so that you find what works for you to be better. The overview of the program has a learning phase, and then you have a phase in which you're designing an experiment and you'll actually run it. And we run several of these, and we'll give you information, and we'll give you a lot of assets and inputs and prompts that you can utilize to design what works for you. We have tools like our Habit Innovation Canvas that we utilize for people to literally design, with a design thinking mindset, the habits that they would like to have to live the type of life they would like to live. And then they're going to test it to see if it works, because a lot of times it doesn't. So then you need to course correct, and that's learning how to learn. And then that's when we're doing our experimentation phase, in which we course correct. So in a very compressed nutshell, this is what we are doing with Optimal Me, taking people from learning to experimenting, designing, executing, learning again, and entering this virtuous cycle of learning how to learn what works for you at this point in your life, which is different from what other people need. So there's no one size fits all, but there might be one process in which we can all discover what's the size that fit us. So, Kat, this is it. This is where we like to offer as a starting point for us to have a conversation. So I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Oseas. I really like the interactivity that you have in this presentation. I'm sure the audience appreciates it. And it also illuminates the main point, and that is this is personal and it's different for everyone. With that, I have a few questions about Optimal Me. And Connie, thanks for joining us.
Lovely to be here with you.
Thank you. I'm wondering, what are kind of the pain points actually that the clients come to you with that lead you to offer this program?
Okay, great. So we've been implementing Optimal Me, I would say, for some time now, and we've been working with different organizations, global organizations throughout different countries and regions. And I would say that the main point has to do with what Oseas was sharing right now, no? To improve our well-being, to improve the work-life integration, the experience that people have within the organization. I would say that even before COVID-19, this was already a hot topic in organizations. We live in a very fast-paced environment, and that demands from us that we're always constantly changing, adapting, reinventing ourselves to anticipate to needs, and that is taking really a heavy toll on us at some point. So probably everybody here in the poll can relate to feeling at some point in time overwhelmed, burned out, stressed, right? And COVID, when it came, obviously it worsened the situation. If we go to the research is already showing that the rates for symptoms related to mental health, such as depression, anxiety, stress, post-traumatic stress, are increasing significantly. And if we consider that we do not usually speak openly about mental health, probably those rates are even much higher. No? So I think that some organizations are taking this matter, this issue seriously. They really are concerned about well-being. They want to help contribute on providing a better quality of life to their employees. I think that they are much more aware and consciously aware of the importance of having, I would say, an integral approach when we talk about performance and effectiveness within our organization, understanding that the state of being of each one of us obviously impacts directly to our ability to deliver results, to our ability to help others grow and learn to their full potential. So yes, I think that there is a need to act, and organizations are taking it seriously, and there is a real concern to improve well-being, I would say.
So obviously one of the main goals that Optimal Me accomplishes or achieves is well-being. Are there any other goals that the program achieves or accomplishes for these organizations, people going through it?
Yes, I would say that it's twofold, no? And Oseas also, he did mention it. Obviously, we want to help people develop new practices in a way that they can internalize, and ideally that they develop new habits that would improve their well-being. And what is very relevant is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. I think that that's one of the key success factors that this program has, that this approach has, that everybody gets to choose their area of interest, what they want to really go through and deepen their ability. That would be one. And the other one is that obviously all organizations are talking about innovation and how to do innovation and how to be more innovative, right? And for that, there is a need to shift our mindsets to an innovation mindset. And the program has been designed in a way that people get to experiment, the cycle of innovation, the cycle of experimentation. So Optimal Me invites all people to see themselves as their own laboratory. Oseas mentioned it. I am my own innovation project. Each one of us is going to experiment in itself, right? And you get to design your experiment, to test it, to learn, to adapt, to adjust, and then to start again the cycle. So it also helps to develop a culture of experimentation. So that's why for us it's a twofold goal. So one of the things that I'll say, I mentioned the key success factor as being this one size does not fit all, but also another thing that we believe it's very relevant, and that is the way it has been designed, is that we want to invite people to to enjoy learning, to really explore learning and connect with the satisfaction of learning, right? And not this burden that we always feel that I should be doing this and I'm not doing this, right? So that's very, very relevant, and that's what we consider when we thought about designing this program.
Thanks, Connie. So you mentioned that we're all our own laboratory, and Oseas gave us an example of how he's experimented with Optimal Me and the process. And can you share an example for us?
Oh, yes, sure. So we ran a cohort for Axialent consultants last year. We were in the middle of the pandemic, and it was really interesting. Also, I think that in this type of programs, it's very interesting, the insights that you get also from your peers and the people that are participating with you. But at that point in time, we were in the middle of the lockdown, and I had a sense of feeling dull and disconnected, I would say, and yeah, I would say a little bit bored, or with a sense of heaviness, right? Moving from working to family, taking care of the kids and all, and I felt that I needed to reconnect and bring much more joy to my days. So that's what I was looking for, bringing much more joy. And I really tried to implement this principle that that we all hear all the time, right? Doing something you love every day, being able to do something you love every day. So I designed an experiment where I would dedicate some time for me every day. I would say that between, I don't know, 45 to at least an hour a day to do something I love. And that would be, a physical activity, but sometimes it would be just reading something inspiring, or having a meditation, a walking meditation, or, investing that time on having a quality time with someone I love. So changing the different activities that I love throughout my week and throughout my day. And for example, for me, I think that one of the key things to learn and to really connect and start being consistent on doing it was to vary the type of activity that I would do, not always the same at the same time. And also I couldn't also do that. Not only the activity, but also the time in the day, right? Changing that helped me develop, and I felt much more connected, and more happy, I would say, in a way, right? More enjoying more life. So yes, that was one. And we hear, all the time about our participants and our clients, and there are a lot of examples. And I like to think about the examples also as a butterfly effect, because there is something maybe there is a very small change that produces, a significant impact in each of our lives. So I remember that we had a senior executive, from the US. I remember he had a global team, and he experimented with intermittent fasting. And he really shared, the impact that had in his, level of energy throughout the day, in the way that he could be much more focused. So it was something that he started changing the way in his nutrition that really had an impact also in his productivity, right? In the way he went about in his day. So that was one, for example. We had another one that was totally different. There was a leader in Singapore, and she worked and she adopted a habit of journaling, a practice of journaling every day. Throughout journaling, she discovered that she increased her emotional intelligence in a way, because she had a much better understanding and recognition of her own emotions throughout the day, right? And she could in that way challenge, the stories that are underlying our emotions. So that helped her be much more grounded and connected. That was another example. And I remember a leader in South America that she shared how she started implementing some of the productivity tools that we shared too. It was the Pomodoro technique specifically. And this was so impactful for me, because it was important for her, so important that she, shared with her family, with her kids, and she started teaching her kids how to adopt it and how to go about with the technique. It helped her be much more focused. So I like to think about that. There are very small, maybe there are small changes that we do that have a very significant impact. And there are a lot of examples, yes.
That's great. There are a lot of examples, whether it be diet or activity or journaling. And I'm actually going to share an example now, because this is a great bridge. So what I love about the Optimal Me process is it can work for all of these different things, as we've been discussing. You just design an experiment, execute, learn, decide on your next steps, and it parallels the process that you can use to change your thinking styles to improve well-being and effectiveness. And when I say thinking styles, I'm referring to the thinking styles measured by our Lifestyles Inventory 360, the LSI. So in a few minutes, Connie, I'll be asking you about your thoughts on the alignment between LSI and Optimal Me. But for those who aren't familiar with the LSI, I'm just going to share some quick info. So it's a 360 that measures the strength of one's constructive, passive, and aggressive thinking and behavior. And we know there's a positive relationship between constructive styles and satisfaction and effectiveness. So our goal is to develop our constructive styles and reduce our passive and aggressive styles. So my example is my LSI profile illuminated where I was at on my constructive styles and also showed a spike in my perfectionistic style. And that's a style in the aggressive cluster. And we know that those styles are related to stress, which obviously takes away from our well-being. So I suppose I always knew I was perfectionistic, but I never really thought much about it or how it was affecting me or others. And so I used a process similar to Optimal Me. I started experimenting. And instead of striving for perfection, I started looking at getting things done well. Not perfectly, but getting them done well. And I noticed a difference. More things were getting done. My stress was less. I became a lot more comfortable delegating, knowing that things were going to be done differently, which is fine and great. And so this is just an example of how one thinking style, perfectionistic, and working on that impacts well-being. And then, as you said, Connie, the butterfly effect. It affects my team and the culture of my team and the business. And so that's just one example around LSI and Optimal Me. And I'm curious, because you're so familiar with both LSI and Optimal Me, how do you see LSI complementing Optimal Me?
Thank you, Kat, for your example. Thank you for sharing. And I love the question because I love the tool. We use it a lot. We use LSI and executive coaching, also in culture development programs, where we combine it also with the other tool, the Oseas, the sister tool, and in leadership development. I think it's a great tool to help understand your leadership style and the impact that it has in terms of effectiveness. But I think that they complement very well. I think that LSI would be a great tool to understand, the opportunities that each one of us have to improve our well-being. When I think about well-being, I think about some elements that impact our quality of life. For example, the quality of our relationships, the sense of accomplishment that we have, the sense of meaning in our life, right? The positive emotions, if we have a sense of flow in the work that we do. And all those elements that impact our well-being can be mapped in the LSI in the constructive style. So throughout running the LSI, you can see to a very good detail, and you can plan how to change the behaviors to improve your well-being on the constructive styles. obviously also on the passive aggressive styles, you can see how those styles are impacting ineffectively your well-being. So for example, I'm thinking out loud, but if we have a constructive style that is, has a tendency by being in charge all the time or being in control, for example, like the power style we talk about, well, it's going to be difficult for me to establish, trusted, lasting relationship, and that would impact, in my well-being, the quality of the relationship that I am about to develop. Also, for example, if I have, an approval style where I'm doing things, to seek approval from others, and I'm very conscious about what others are thinking, then my sense of accomplishment or connection with the sense of achievement, it's going to be mined in a way. It's going to be undermined. So there's two small examples that I also can think about how to connect it, but I really think it's a very powerful tool that clearly can be used and gives us a lot of insights in terms of well-being.
Thanks, Connie. So we have some questions here for the two of you. The first question is, how do you achieve lasting, sustainable change? So what's your advice around achieving sustainable, long-lasting change?
Well, there's a few things that come to mind. Obviously, I think that question is so interesting that it's lent itself for countless books, research articles, etc. So pretending that we can capture the response in a few minutes is nonsensical. However, there's a few interesting things that we might be able to put forward. For me, for example, one thing that is crucial in attaining long-lasting change is that you need to like what you're doing. If you say, well, I want to be, I don't know, a lifelong meditator, but I hate meditating, probably not going to work. So a lot of this is counterintuitive, because for example, a lot of people tell me, well, how can you eat healthy? Because sometimes that is equated with eating stuff that doesn't taste good. And the answer is, I love what I eat. It's healthy, but it tastes delicious. So I need to put in the work on making sure that I'm achieving that intersection. Or how can you get up at 4:30 a.m. in the morning to do workouts? Like that requires a lot of willpower. It requires less willpower if you actually like it. And a lot of times people don't like, for example, they think, how am I going to sustain physical activity for the rest of my life? And maybe what they have in mind is, I don't know, an hour of elliptical, and they don't like it. Well, then don't do that. Do something else. So focus on, in innovation, we would say, love the problem, not your solution. So if what I'm trying to solve for is getting movement in my life, focus on it, instead of saying, well, my solution is the elliptical, and then that's what I'm stuck with. Same thing goes for pretty much anything else. So first aspect, I would say, you have to like what you're doing. The second aspect is you have to have a good reason to do it. And it's very, it sounds like super obvious. But when you ask people that are struggling with some of the examples that we saw today, like doing my yoga, my exercise, meditation, why do you want to do this? A lot of times the reason is rather thin. Well, it's good for me. How is it good for you? Well, I don't know, I'm going to live longer. How can you be sure? Well, I'm not very sure. Well, then that's not a very compelling case that you're making for that change that is going to require you to have some energy. So if you don't really have a good motive to do something and you don't like doing it, well, no wonder it's difficult to sustain it for the long term. So for me, I would start with those two. And then there's lots of tips and tricks that will allow you to learn what is the version of that doing that works for you at this point in your life.
Yeah. And I also, adding to that, which I totally relate, something that really stuck to me when we did the program, and also what I hear from some of the participants, is this principle that we went about aiming low and then aiming high. Yep. Generally, when we start and we're looking for a change, we put the bar very high, right? We wanna start running. We want to start running from day one, 10 kilometers, and that is so far away that it's really demotivating in a way. It's very difficult to achieve on day one. So we get a little bit disconnected from the target, from the goal. If we aim low at the beginning until we get the rhythm and the consistency, that gives us the energy, and it's reinforcing to continue the journey, right? it's aiming low and then aiming high once you do it, or also consistency over intensity. Sometimes we believe, I don't know, maybe when we do physical, right, activity, we go to the gym and we just kill ourselves one day and then we don't go for a week, and that doesn't really work. I mean, we need to be really consistent and taking a baby step every day towards our goal. I think that is a very powerful concept, the aiming low, which really connected with me and with a lot of participants too.
That makes sense. Here's another question that just came in. What is the most common obstacle people experience in the experimentation process?
Oh, I have a couple of important ones for that one. And I want to build up on what Connie mentioned. So interestingly enough, I would say the first obstacle that I see the most frequently that we find is the belief of the importance of willpower. And what I mean by this is a lot of people say, well, I can't do the exercise or the eating or the meditation because I don't have the discipline or the willpower. We saw it in today's poll. That's why I asked it. The challenge when you think that way, think of the implications. What do you do if you lack willpower? A lot of people tell me, well, you're able to do these things because you have willpower. And then what do you do? Where do you buy it? How do you increase it? At some point, what that reflects is terminal thinking. It could be a fixed mindset or a victim mindset. Well, I was not blessed in the lottery of good quality with that willpower, and because I don't have it, well, then here I am. Nothing I can do about it. Or another version of that is like, I'm going to try harder next time. And we all know how it goes. A lot of times we try harder, and it still doesn't work. So you either just give up, throw your hands in the air because you don't have the willpower, or you just try harder, and that doesn't work. So to me, that's a very important obstacle when people experience trying to set up experiments, because they don't get out of that mindset of I need to try harder or I can't do it. Instead of getting creative and looking at, wait a second, what are the different tools and levers and things that I can play with to find what works for me? So that's one aspect. And the other aspect connected to what Connie mentioned, this idea of starting small, aiming low, etc. You'll see it in all popular books around it and even research. So you'll have maybe B.J. Fogg has a book entirely dedicated to the idea of tiny habits, or maybe James Clear in Atomic Habits talks about the importance of increasing 1%. And I remember somebody made a very passionate plea for this. This is a Canadian psychologist, and I'm blinking out his name. But the point he was making is ego gets in the way. A lot of times I want to start exercising, and I have not done it for years. So tomorrow I want to start running 5K or doing an hour of exercise, doing it 3 times a week, and I'm not ready. But I'm not willing, in my own eyes, to lower myself to only doing 10 minutes because it doesn't sound like it's enough. There's nothing heroic about it, would say the psychologist. And because of that, we don't get started. So being able to start at a level that is low enough for me to be able to get momentum through repetition so that eventually I get to where I want is the other obstacle. People in general, all of us really struggle with the small start to build momentum. And a lot of time it's ego. So in short, the belief in the importance of willpower, which I'm not saying is not important, what I'm saying is not the only thing, and ego.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great advice. A couple more questions have come in. One around what audience you work with in terms of industry, country, level of people in the organization, etc.
Okay, I can take it and share, and then Oseas, you can complement. We work, we're a global consulting firm, so we work worldwide. We've been working a lot with, I would say, group of leaders in the organization, leaders that they have this double role, obviously taking care of themselves, but they need to lead and take care of their people. So in our philosophy and the principle is to really be able to help others, to support others, grow and develop. I need to take care first of myself. So the intention is to really just first help them develop and start shifting into improving their well-being before they can take this to their teams, right? To share with their team some of the aspects that could help them improve their well-being. So I would say leaders and different layers within the organization, very senior leaders, middle managers too, which you know, are responsible for the execution. Yes, so that's a bit of the audience.
Another question here from the audience is, What is the logic for doing this in a group as opposed to a self-study? So is there a benefit to doing Optimal Me with a group or a team as opposed to doing it alone?
From my perspective, there's many advantages of doing that. First of all, if you want to do self-study, I think that helps a lot in areas or bodies of knowledge that are, I would say, very well structured and always work the same. For example, if you want to learn computer coding of a certain language, it works a certain way. You can approach it different ways, but at the end of the day, there is a way that works and a way that doesn't work, with some minor differences. Whereas when we're trying to enter this other space, there's a lot more variability that we could say, these are good principles to follow, but how are those implemented in your particular situation, in your life moment, is different from others. So that variability, I think, is well served by having people coming from different walks of life, and in groups, we harness that. So for example, we might have groups that have an affinity for solving a problem that has to do with nutrition, and then they can have these conversations. I tried this. This is what happened. This is why it didn't work. This is what I learned. This is what worked for me. And isn't that exchange and that cross-pollination that we see where people have most of their aha moments? So instead of us saying, we have the truth and now let us bestow it upon you, we set up a stage in which you say, here's a few good questions you can ask yourselves. Here's a few principles. Here's pieces of information. And when you're thinking about how to do it and you have the exchange, a lot of things click and come together. So to me, that is a very valuable aspect of doing it in teams.
Yes, and just to complement, I think that so we do it in intact teams, also in different groups, and I think that it helps also and it contributes to increasing psychological safety, where each one of us is sharing, you know, what is our pain, what are we trying to achieve, what are we struggling. So there is a lot of sharing throughout the program that I think that creates connection and a sense of trust within the team, right? Everybody gets to know how, and you can also, you know, offer help. We start creating a community of practice, I would say, within the team, where people can support each other while they are trying to do their experiments, while they are trying to learn that. So we see a lot of benefits of doing it, yes, in teams and groups.
Few more questions have come in. I don't know if you've been following them here. Do you see a question that you'd like to pick out here from the audience? Otherwise, I can read one to you. We have time for a couple more.
Oh, this one is interesting. How much time do I have to experiment so I know I have success, right? The feeling of success. And this is, well, my perspective is it depends. I don't think there is a defined time frame for this, and it will depend on the impact that it's having on oneself. One thing that Oseas was saying that for me it's really relevant, understanding what I'm aiming, what is it that I'm looking for when I decide to focus on nutrition, what is the result, the end game that I'm looking for. And I think that success or effectiveness indeed, that will be when I started to feeling in my own body, right? The sense of achievement that I have when I start moving closer. But it's a one day at a time, right? It's not that it's an everlasting, I would say, process. We can go as deep as needed, going, you know, into being much more accurate in terms of the habits that we have. So I would say that it depends from each one, and it depends on the sense that you have from achieving or not the outcome.
Let me build on to that because I think maybe I'm assuming that this question might be also referencing some of the, you know, tidbits of knowledge, air quotes, that are flying around. For example, I've heard lots of people that tell me, well, I read that you will build a new habit in 21 days. And then somebody raises their hand, not 21, it's 37. And then everybody has their magic number. So the first thing that I would say is I have not yet come across a piece of replicable scientific studies that say any person from any walk of life, whenever they're trying to establish any habit, they just need to go through this amount of days and boom, you built it. Haven't seen it. As a matter of fact, you might start seeing differences, to Connie's point, on what is the thing that you're trying to adopt. It might be a lot easier to start a habit of, I don't know, journaling a page a day versus completely overhauling how you incorporate movement in your life. It might be different depending on where you're starting. So unfortunately, there is not one size fits all answer, but it's much more interesting to look at the self-knowledge as the reference of what works for you. And to me, the most important aspect, more than the time, are the milestones. And the first milestone is, I'm starting to like this. If you find that in the first week, the second week, or the third week, good. But at some point, I'm starting to like this. I'm starting to get the hang of it. I'm starting to understand why it was more difficult to do, and I have kind of a cigarette circumvented. So as you start getting those milestones, to me, that's much more important than the amount of time that it took you to get there. But you can certainly make the time to get there shorter if you are much more purposeful about discovering them and you treat this as a learning process. You learn what doesn't work until you find what works, versus trying to perform right off the gates.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Now, there's one question here that I like, the one of how do we address organizational culture and how can that encourage personal health? And that obviously will support performance better. So if I may just take that, and Connie, please help me build on this. The question of how do we address organizational culture is quite critical. One of the things that we've been having discussions on is many of our clients actually care about the well-being of their people, and they're trying their best to help with it in some capacity, but it's not easy. There's not like, this is the answer, and then let's just do that because it's not obvious. There's many other clients, quite honestly, well, maybe not our clients, but many other companies that I would say top leadership doesn't really care. They just want more productivity, but that sounds bad. So they can go and buy one of these programs as pretty much just a painkiller for their conscience. Like, this feels bad, let's just throw that in. But we're still gonna be pressuring people into working extra hours and not speaking out, etc. And you cannot offset crappy organizational culture with all the best well-being programs in the world. That's just not gonna work. So one of the things that we do at Axialent is we actually have those tough conversations, because the focus of Axialent is cultural transformation. That's how we were born. That's what we've been doing for years. Optimal Me is a latecomer to the party, in the sense that it's been around for only 2 years, and the company has been around for more than 15. So it is born in the context of this organization that already had these conversations with the C-suite, the tough ones. Do we really care about this? What really are our values? How are we gonna embody them in real life? And then within that context, then we can talk about something as specific, as relevant as well-being.
Yes, I agree with what you were saying, Oseas. And also, as I was sharing before, we work with a lot of leaders in organizations, and leaders have this double role. They have this fundamental role that has to do with role modeling the culture that they want to see in their organization, right? So everything that we do with them, every time we work with them, we're trying to work on intervening on building the type of culture that they want to have. So during the program, yes, there is also a twofold intention. We work with leaders so they can really grasp and start learning how to apply new practices for their own well-being, but they can take that further to their organization and to their teams, right? The intent is that they help shape also and improve the well-being of their teams. Oseas was talking about conversations, putting the tough conversations on the table, like mental health right now. It's a tough conversation to have for some people, for a lot of us. And that's something that we encourage and we look for through the program.
Right, and the connections between the lifestyles inventory and the organizational culture inventory, and the way that we know that, perfectionism as a style in a leader is going to most likely show up as perfectionism in a team's culture or a department's culture. And the years of research show that that type of aggressive style is related to stress and turnover and things that we can prevent by working on ourselves and becoming more constructive and applying these models like Optimal Me. I think I saw one last question in here, and we do have a couple of minutes. Do you see significant differences in well-being and corporate support in European countries versus the United States? Or maybe you have an example of what support looks like, which you shared a little bit about previously.
One thing that captures my attention that partly touches on this question is my perspective has been that a lot of times well-being overall is taken as something that needs to be addressed by a small part of the organization. For example, well-being is very important. Well, what is our HR benefits person doing? Okay, you're it, figure it out. And then the benefits person has some money and they need to make most of it. So, well-being is going to be composed of these benefits, and it could be like maybe the flexible workday and this parental leave and this free meditation app subscription, and you have good insurance. Good luck. That's it. So I'm not saying that these things that the person in the benefits department are doing are not good things to do, but what I'm saying is I've seen a lot of approaches in which it's just taken as another box to check, but it's not really covered by more important conversations at the top leadership level that have, in many cases, a much more meaningful impact in the experience that people have of being in their companies. So I've seen a lot of that in American companies. I don't know if it's maybe due to a certain type of regulatory environment that requires for you to have certain boxes checked, and then once you have those checked, then you're pretty much done. I would not say that that's not present in European countries. It's just that the regulatory environment does vary from one country to another, right? So then it's a little bit more difficult to say, well, you know, Spain versus Germany, not the same. So.
Yeah. Last question here is, are you capturing the experiments, goals, tools, and approaches being used and sharing across the cohorts? So are you creating visibility basically into what's being done and how effective it is for the community of practice to dip into as a toolbox?
Yes and no. So the part of the yes is we do it when the participants are willing to share enough level of detail that then we can, you know, share with others. But we try to walk in this very, very, very thin line of let's make sure we're supporting you in your work, but at the same time affording you to still have the privacy of working on yourself and not overstepping. So in some cases we actually get those, and then we take examples, best practices for others. And in some cases it's just the lockbox in which we know people are doing something. They tell us what's happening, the inputs on the outputs, but we don't really know what's going on in the middle, and that's the way they prefer it.
Thank you both. We are approaching the end of the hour here. And I don't see any additional questions, so I think we got to most of them. Thank you to the audience for attending. We will be sending a follow-up email or two with a link to the recording and additional information on Optimal Me and the Lifestyles Inventory. Thank you all so much, and thank you very much, Connie and Oseas. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.